In the heart of the vast and verdant lands of West Africa, where the great Niger River bends like a colossal, slumbering serpent, lay the Mali Empire. It was an empire not forged in the clamor of endless war, but woven together with threads of gold, salt, and knowledge. Its capital, Niani, was a jewel nestled amongst rolling hills and ancient baobab trees, a city humming with the gentle music of life. The air itself seemed to carry the scent of baked earth, sweet mangoes, and the distant, spicy aroma of the markets. Here, in a palace of beaten earth and fine wood, cool and shaded from the generous sun, lived the emperor, the Mansa. His name was Musa, and his spirit was as deep and tranquil as the river that nourished his lands. He was not a young man, nor was he old. He was in that perfect season of life where the fire of ambition has softened into the warm, steady glow of wisdom. His eyes, dark and thoughtful, had seen the prosperity of his people, the caravans laden with gold dust journeying north, and the scrolls of learning arriving from across the world. Yet within his heart, a quiet yearning had taken root, a sacred call that whispered on the evening breeze. It was the call of the Hajj, the pilgrimage to the holy city of Mecca, a journey that every devout Muslim dreams of making. This was not a decision made in haste. For many seasons, as the sun painted the sky in hues of orange and lilac, Mansa Musa would walk in his private gardens. The gardens were a paradise of their own, filled with the gentle cooing of doves, the rustle of palm fronds, and the soft gurgle of irrigation channels bringing life from the river. He would sit by a reflection pool, watching the koi, their scales shimmering like living jewels, and contemplate the magnitude of such an undertaking. It would be a journey of thousands of miles, across savannah, through the formidable expanse of the Sahara, and into lands he knew only from the tales of merchants and the maps of scholars. He envisioned it not as a conquest, but as a procession of peace, a river of people and faith flowing from the heart of Mali to the heart of the Islamic world. He would not go as a warrior, but as a pilgrim. He would not carry swords to conquer, but gold to give, knowledge to share, and a heart open to the wonders of God's creation. And so, one cool evening, with the first stars beginning to prick the velvet dome of the sky, he made his decision. He called for his most trusted advisors, his griots, the living libraries of his people, and his chief architects and quartermasters. They gathered in the grand audience hall, a space of soaring wooden pillars and intricate carvings, the air thick with the scent of sandalwood incense. "The time has come," Mansa Musa said, his voice calm and resonant, a voice that carried the weight of authority but was softened with humility. "I will answer the call. I will make the pilgrimage to Mecca." A respectful silence filled the hall. The advisors understood. This was not merely a journey, it was a statement. It was Mali announcing its presence to the world, not with the roar of a lion, but with the quiet, undeniable gravity of a mountain of gold. The preparations began, and they were unlike anything the empire had ever seen. It was not the frantic, urgent preparation for war, but the slow, meticulous, and joyful preparation for a sacred festival. The entire empire seemed to hum with a new purpose. From the southern goldfields of Bambuk and Bure, miners brought forth the earth's most precious gift. They did not hack it from the ground with greed, but coaxed it, panning the riverbeds and carefully extracting the nuggets and fine dust that shimmered with the light of the sun. This gold was not for hoarding in dark vaults. It was destined for charity, for building mosques, for funding universities, and for showing the world the bounty with which the Mali Empire had been blessed. In the bustling markets of Niani, merchants began to gather the finest goods. Bolts of cotton, dyed in brilliant indigo and rich madder red, were stacked high. The weavers of the empire were masters of their craft, their looms clicking and clacking from dawn until dusk, creating intricate patterns that told stories of spirits, ancestors, and the rhythms of the river. Spices arrived on caravans from the east, cloves, peppercorns, and cinnamon, their fragrances mingling in the warm air. Great sacks of salt, cut into heavy blocks from the mines of Tagaza in the north, were brought down, each block as valuable as gold in the southern forests. The quartermasters, men of immense organizational skill, began the colossal task of provisioning the caravan. They calculated the needs for a journey that would span more than a year. Tens of thousands of people would be joining the Mansa. There were his royal court, his family, his advisors, and a significant portion of his army, not as an invading force, but as an honor guard, and a means of protection and order for the vast procession. But there were also doctors and their assistants, carrying chests of herbs and medical instruments. There were scholars, their bags filled with precious books and blank parchment, ready to learn and to teach. There were cooks and bakers, water-bearers and tent-makers. And, of course, there were the griots, their minds and voices primed to record every step of the journey, to turn the epic trek into song and story for generations to come. The most crucial members of the caravan, however, were the camels, the great, patient ships of the desert. Thousands upon thousands of them were gathered from all corners of the empire. They were strong, resilient creatures, with long, elegant eyelashes that protected their soulful eyes from the sun and sand. Each camel was chosen with care, its health and temperament assessed. They were fitted with custom-made saddles and harnesses of the finest leather, decorated with colorful tassels and polished brass. A special contingent of 100 camels was set aside for a unique purpose. Each would carry a load of pure gold dust, packed in sturdy leather satchels. This was the gold of charity, the gold that would flow like a river into the hands of the needy along the path. As the months of preparation unfolded, Niani became a city of gentle, purposeful activity. There was no shouting, no chaos. Every task was performed with a sense of shared purpose and quiet dignity. In the evenings, the people would gather in the squares to listen to the kora, its 21 strings plucked by a master griot, the notes falling like cool water in the warm night air. The stories they told were of Sundiata Keita, the great founder of their empire, the Lion King. They sang of his wisdom, his strength, and the unity he had forged. Now they were adding a new verse, a new chapter, the great pilgrimage of Mansa Musa, the lion's worthy descendant. Mansa Musa himself oversaw every detail, not with the impatience of a king, but with the care of a gardener tending his most precious plants. He spoke with the camel drivers, asking about the health of their animals. He sat with the scholars, discussing the books they should bring and the knowledge they hoped to find. He walked through the markets, speaking with the merchants, his presence a calming and reassuring force. One evening, he summoned a young astronomer named Kale to his gardens. Kale was a brilliant but quiet man, whose greatest joy was to map the celestial bodies. He arrived, bowing low, his heart fluttering with a mixture of awe and nervousness. "Kale," the Mansa said, his voice as gentle as the rustling leaves, "you will journey with us. Your task is a vital one. The stars have guided travelers for centuries. On our journey through the great desert, they will be our most faithful map. I want you to teach us. Teach us their names, their stories, their movements. When we are surrounded by an ocean of sand, I want my people to look up and feel not lost, but guided by the heavens." Kale's eyes widened. This was a greater honor than he could have ever imagined. "It will be my life's privilege, great Mansa," he whispered, his voice filled with emotion. Finally, the day of departure arrived. It was a day not of fanfare and trumpets, but of prayer and quiet farewells. The sun rose over Niani, casting a golden glow upon the city. The great caravan was assembled on the plains outside the walls, a breathtaking sight. It was not a rigid military column, but a sprawling, organic river of life, stretching for miles. Tens of thousands of people, thousands of camels, and countless horses, all adorned in the vibrant colors of Mali. The air was filled with the low hum of conversation, the soft jingling of harnesses, and the gentle, rhythmic chewing of the camels. Mansa Musa, dressed in simple but elegant white robes, rode his favorite stallion, a magnificent creature as black as polished obsidian. He moved through the procession, his presence a benediction. He did not lead from the very front, but placed himself in the heart of his people. He stopped to speak with a family, to bless a child, to share a word with an elderly griot. As the sun climbed higher, a profound silence fell over the assembly. It was time for the morning prayer. Tens of thousands of figures turned as one to face the east, towards the distant promise of Mecca. They knelt upon the warm earth, their foreheads touching the ground in a universal gesture of submission and faith. The collective, whispered prayer rose into the air, a sound of immense power and profound peace. When the prayer was complete, Mansa Musa gave the signal. There was no shout, no command. A single drum began to beat, a slow, steady rhythm like the heartbeat of the empire itself. The head of the caravan began to move. The river of people and animals stirred, and with a gentle, flowing motion, the great pilgrimage began. They moved slowly, deliberately, leaving behind the familiar green of Niani and heading east, towards the rising sun and the unknown horizon. The journey of 1,000 stories had begun with a single prayerful step. The first part of the journey was a gentle unfurling, a slow transition from the familiar embrace of the capital to the vast, open arms of the savannah. For weeks, the caravan moved through the heartlands of the Mali Empire, a world painted in shades of ochre, green, and gold. The landscape was a tapestry of sprawling grasslands dotted with the iconic silhouettes of baobab trees, their thick, ancient trunks seeming to hold the wisdom of centuries. Acacia trees, with their feathery leaves and sharp thorns, provided pockets of shade where gazelles and antelopes would pause, their liquid eyes watching the peaceful procession pass by. The rhythm of the caravan quickly settled into a serene and predictable pattern, a routine that became as comforting as a lullaby. Long before the sun made its first appearance, the camp would begin to stir. The first sounds were the soft whispers of prayers, a collective murmur that greeted the pale, pre-dawn light. Then came the gentle clatter of pots and pans as the cooks prepared the morning meal, simple, nourishing porridge made from millet, sweetened with honey and dates. As the travelers ate, the sky would perform its daily miracle, shifting from deep indigo to soft lavender, then to a blush of rose, and finally to a brilliant, life-giving gold as the sun crested the horizon. This was the signal to move. The tents were struck with quiet efficiency, the camels knelt patiently to be loaded, and the great river of life would once again begin its slow eastward flow. They traveled through the cooler hours of the morning, the sun warm on their backs. The air was filled with the sounds of the journey, the soft, rhythmic padding of thousands of camel feet on the dusty earth, the gentle creak of leather saddles, the distant, melodious calls of birds, and the low hum of conversation. The griots, masters of oral tradition, would often walk alongside groups of travelers, their voices rising and falling in the timeless cadence of storytelling. They sang the epics of Mali, tales of courage, love, and magic, their words weaving a comforting blanket of shared history around the pilgrims. Jeli Fode, the eldest of the griots, was a man whose face was a map of a long and thoughtful life. His voice was not loud, but it had a texture like old wood and honey, and it captivated all who listened. He would often walk near the Mansa, and as they traveled, he would recount the history of the very lands they were crossing. "Here, great Mansa," he would say, pointing a gnarled finger towards a cluster of granite boulders, "is where the great Sumanguru was said to have hidden his magical balafon. And this stream, its water is said to grant clear vision to those who drink it with a pure heart." His stories connected them to the land, making it not just a space to be crossed, but a living, breathing entity filled with memory and meaning. Around midday, when the sun reached its zenith and the air grew heavy with heat, the caravan would halt. This was a time for rest and reflection. In the shade of a large baobab or in the cool interiors of the spacious tents, the people would rest. Some would sleep, their bodies lulled by the heat and the gentle drone of insects. Others would gather in small groups to talk, to mend clothing, or to play quiet games of Senet, the ancient board game of strategy. The young astronomer Kale would use this time to make his observations, using a simple but effective astrolabe to measure the position of the sun. He kept meticulous records, his elegant script filling the pages of his journal. Children, their eyes wide with curiosity, would often gather around him, and he would patiently explain how the sun's journey across the sky could tell them where they were and where they were going. Mansa Musa used these midday hours to attend to the needs of his mobile kingdom. He would meet with his advisors, listen to reports from the scouts who ranged ahead of the main body, and ensure that the distribution of food and water was fair and sufficient for all. His tent was always open, and any of his subjects, from the highest-ranking general to the humblest water carrier, could approach him with a concern or a request. He listened with an attentiveness that made each person feel seen and valued. As the afternoon heat began to soften, the journey would resume for a few more hours, until the sun began its descent, painting the western sky in fiery colors. The selection of a campsite for the night was a careful process. The scouts would find a place with adequate grazing for the animals and, whenever possible, near a source of water. The evenings were perhaps the most magical part of the day. As the vast camp was set up, a city of tents rising from the savannah, the air would fill with the enticing aromas of the evening meal being cooked over hundreds of small fires. The meal was a time of community, of sharing food and stories of the day's travel. After the meal and the evening prayer, a special kind of tranquility would settle over the camp. The sky, free from the lights of any city, was a spectacle of breathtaking beauty. The stars emerged, not as faint specks, but as brilliant, blazing diamonds scattered across a canvas of the deepest black. The Milky Way was a luminous river of light, a celestial echo of the Niger they had left behind. This was Kale's time. He would set up his observation post, and soon a crowd would gather. Mansa Musa himself was a frequent attendee of these open-air lectures. With a long, slender pointer, Kale would trace the constellations, bringing the sky to life. "That," he would say, his voice filled with a quiet passion, "is the scorpion, its tail curled as if ready to strike. The hunters say it chases the great celestial elephant across the sky. And there, the three bright stars in a row, merchants call them the three camels, forever walking the path to the North Star, the one constant point that guides all lost travelers home." He told them how the moon governed the tides of distant oceans they had never seen, and how its phases marked the passage of the months. He taught them to find their direction by the stars, to read the sky as a map and a clock. Under his tutelage, the vast, intimidating night sky became a familiar, comforting presence, a ceiling of wonders for their temporary home. The caravan was not an isolated entity moving through an empty land. It passed through the territories of the many peoples who owed allegiance to the Mali Empire. They did not pass as conquerors demanding tribute, but as benevolent sovereigns on a holy mission. As they approached a town or a large village, heralds would ride ahead to announce the Mansa's coming. The reception was always one of joy and celebration. The villagers would line the path, dressed in their finest clothes, playing drums and flutes, their songs of welcome drifting on the breeze. Mansa Musa would halt the caravan and ride forward to greet the local chieftain or elder. He would dismount, a gesture of respect, and they would exchange formal greetings, inquiries after health, family, and the prosperity of the harvest. And then, the charity would begin. The 100 camels laden with gold would be brought forward. The Mansa's servants, with scoops made of polished calabash, would distribute the shimmering gold dust, not just to the chieftains, but to every single person, to the elderly, to the children, to the farmers, to the potters. It was given freely, with a smile and a blessing. The amount was often enough to change a family's fortune, to allow them to buy new tools, to repair a roof, or to provide a dowry for a daughter. The people's gratitude was overwhelming, their prayers for the Mansa's safe journey heartfelt and sincere. But the gifts were not only material. The scholars of the caravan would meet with the local imams and teachers, sharing books and debating points of theology and law. The doctors would set up clinics, treating the sick and sharing their knowledge of herbal remedies. The weavers from Niani would admire the local patterns and share techniques of their own, a quiet and beautiful exchange of artistry. In this way, the pilgrimage was not just a journey through the empire, but a journey that strengthened it. It was a golden thread that stitched the heart of the empire to its farthest reaches, reinforcing bonds of loyalty not through fear, but through generosity, respect, and a shared sense of purpose. Night after night, the caravan would rest under the watchful eyes of the stars. Day after day, it would move with its slow and steady rhythm. The land began to change. The grass grew sparser, the trees became smaller and hardier, and the earth grew sandier. The air became drier, and the sun seemed to shine with a more intense, unfiltered brilliance. They were leaving the familiar savanna behind and approaching the edge of the great sea of sand, the Sahara. The first chapter of their journey was drawing to a close, and the next, more challenging and more profound, was about to begin. But they faced it not with fear, but with a quiet confidence, their hearts filled with the peace and unity they had cultivated on their slow and blessed journey eastward. The city of Walata was the last great bastion of green before the immensity of the Sahara. It was a city born of the desert trade, a nexus of stone and clay, where the savanna breathed its last sigh and the sands began their reign. For the caravan of Mansa Musa, Walata was more than just a stopping point. It was a gateway, a place of final preparation for the arduous journey ahead. Upon their arrival, the city, usually a hub of measured commercial activity, blossomed with a festive energy. The people of Walata, a mix of Mande, Fulani, and the nomadic Tuareg, the famed blue men of the desert, welcomed the Mansa's procession with awe and reverence. The distribution of gold here was prodigious, a final act of generosity to his own people before he entered the lands of others. The markets overflowed with the goods the caravan brought, and in turn, the pilgrims restocked their own supplies, preparing for the lean weeks to come. It was in Walata that Mansa Musa held council with the Tuareg guides. These were men whose lineage was tied to the desert itself. They knew its moods, its secrets, and its dangers. They could navigate by the slightest shift in the wind's direction, by the texture of the sand under their feet, and by the ancient, invisible pathways that only they could see. Their leader was a man named Tariq, his face weathered by sun and wind to the texture of worn leather, his eyes the color of the pale desert sky, holding a deep, unhurried wisdom. He was wrapped in indigo robes, the dye having stained his skin, giving his people their famous moniker. They met not in a grand hall, but in a simple tent, sitting on thick wool carpets and sipping sweet, frothy mint tea poured from a great height in the traditional way. "The desert is a demanding host, great Mansa," Tariq said, his voice a low, gravelly whisper. "It does not suffer fools or the impatient. It demands respect. It demands that you listen to its silence. We will guide you. We will show you the way to the wells, the oases that are the desert's emerald tears. But you must trust in our rhythm, a rhythm dictated by the sun, the moon, and the endurance of the camels." Mansa Musa inclined his head, a gesture of complete trust. "Your wisdom is as renowned as the desert is vast, Tariq. We are not conquerors seeking to tame the sand. We are pilgrims seeking to pass through it with humility. We place our journey in your capable hands and our faith in God." The preparations in Walata were focused and practical. Water was the new gold. Thousands of goatskin water bags were filled, treated, and loaded onto the strongest camels. The provisions were checked and rechecked: dried meats, dates, figs, and hardy grains that would sustain them. The people were instructed on how to conserve water, how to protect themselves from the sun, and how to read the early signs of heat exhaustion. After a week of rest and preparation, the day came to enter the Sahara. The departure from Walata was different from the one in Niani. A profound quietness settled over the caravan. The cheerful chatter was replaced by a more contemplative silence. As they moved north, the last vestiges of green vanished with an almost startling finality. One moment there were hardy acacia trees and patches of tough grass, and the next there was nothing but sand. It was an ocean of sand, stretching to every horizon, vast and overwhelming. The dunes rose and fell in gentle, sweeping curves, their shapes constantly shifting, sculpted by the patient hand of the wind. The sun beat down from a sky that was a piercing, cloudless blue, and the light reflecting off the sand was so bright it was almost blinding. The rhythm of the journey changed, adapting to the desert's harsh demands. They now rested during the brutal heat of the day, huddled in the shade of their tents, conserving their energy and their water. The tents, woven from thick camel hair, were marvels of design, providing a surprising coolness within. During this long, enforced stillness, life in the caravan turned inward. The scholars would read and debate in hushed tones. The weavers would work on small, portable looms. Mothers would tell quiet stories to their children. It was a time of deep rest, of meditation, of gathering strength for the journey ahead. The real travel took place in the cooler hours of the late afternoon, and often, long into the night. As the sun began to dip towards the western horizon, the desert would undergo a magical transformation. The harsh, white glare softened into a warm, golden light. The dunes, which had seemed a uniform color, now revealed a palette of subtle hues: apricot, rose, ochre, and soft purple in the lengthening shadows. To travel by the light of the setting sun and the rising moon was to experience a world of profound and serene beauty. The air grew cool and crisp. The only sounds were the soft swish of the camels, feet in the sand, and the faint musical creaking of their leather harnesses. The world was reduced to the essential: the sand beneath, the stars above, and the slow, steady forward movement of the community. It was in the heart of this immense silence that the people of the caravan truly began to look up. The night sky in the Sahara was a revelation. With no competing lights, no haze, and no moisture in the air, the heavens were revealed in their full, staggering glory. The stars did not just twinkle. They blazed with a fierce, cold fire. The constellations were so clear they seemed almost close enough to touch. Kale, the astronomer, became one of the most important men in the caravan. Each night, as they made camp, his sky talks became the focal point of their evening life. He would stand on a small dune, his silhouette dark against the star-dusted sky, and with his pointer he would guide them through the cosmos. "The desert and the sky are 2 pages of the same book," he would say, his voice carrying clearly in the still night air. "Look there. The Tuareg call that constellation the Camel's Knee. When it rises just after sunset, they know the coldest nights of the season are coming. And see that faint misty patch? That is not a cloud. It is a cluster of 1,000 stars, a celestial city so far away that their light has been traveling since the time of our ancestors to reach our eyes tonight." Mansa Musa was his most devoted student. The king, who commanded one of the world's greatest empires, found a deep and abiding humility under the Saharan stars. He felt his own smallness in the face of such cosmic grandeur, and yet he also felt an overwhelming sense of connection. He was a tiny part of this vast, intricate, and divinely ordered universe. The worries of empire, the weight of his gold, all of it seemed to shrink to its proper perspective. His pilgrimage became less about arriving in Mecca and more about the journey itself, this slow, meditative passage through a landscape that stripped away all that was unnecessary and revealed the essential. The Tuareg guides, led by Tariq, moved with an assurance that was almost supernatural. They would read the patterns of the wind on the sand, the way a shadow fell from a rare rock formation, and navigate with unerring accuracy. They led the caravan from one hidden well to the next, these small, miraculous pockets of life-giving water that were the lifeblood of the desert. The discovery of an oasis was a moment of quiet, profound joy. The first sign would be a subtle shift in the air, a hint of moisture, or the distant sight of a solitary palm tree. As they drew closer, the green would become more definite, a splash of impossible color against the monochrome sand. Reaching an oasis was a cause for celebration and gratitude. The camels would drink their fill, their long necks bent to the water. The people would replenish their skins, wash the dust from their faces and clothes, and rest in the shade of the date palms. The dates themselves, sweet and nourishing, were a gift from God, a reward for their perseverance. Of course, the desert was not without its challenges. There were days when the wind would rise, whipping the sand into a stinging, blinding fury. During these sandstorms, the caravan would come to a complete halt. The camels would kneel, tucking their heads down, and the people would retreat into their tents, sealing the flaps tight. The world outside would become a roaring, howling chaos of sand and wind. But even these moments were not ones of terror. They were accepted as part of the desert's nature. Inside the tents, the storm's fury was muffled to a low, continuous roar. It was another time for enforced stillness. Jelifode, the old griot, would gather people in the larger tents, and his voice would rise above the sound of the wind, telling stories that were older than the storm itself. He spoke of the desert spirits, the jinn who rode the winds, and of ancient kings who had tried and failed to conquer the Sahara. His stories taught them that one did not fight the desert. One waited, one listened, and one respected its power. And when the wind finally died down, and they emerged from their tents into a world scoured clean and reshaped, there was a sense of renewal, of having passed through a great trial together, and emerged unscathed. During the long desert crossing, the community of the caravan grew even stronger. The shared hardship and the shared beauty bonded them in a way that life in the bustling city never could. They learned to rely on each other completely. A person's wealth or status meant little when faced with the vast, impartial reality of the sand and sun. What mattered was endurance, kindness, and a willingness to share the last drops of water in one's flask. Mansa Musa himself was a model of this behavior. He ate the same food as his people, rested in a tent that was only slightly larger than the others, and spent his evenings not in seclusion but among his subjects, listening to the stories of the griots and learning the star charts from Kale. He saw his people not as subjects to be ruled, but as fellow pilgrims on a sacred path. One evening, deep in the heart of the desert, a young boy fell gravely ill with a fever. The caravan's doctors did all they could, but the boy grew weaker. His mother was beside herself with grief and fear. When word reached Mansa Musa, he left his tent immediately and went to the family's side. He knelt by the boy's pallet, his royal presence filling the small tent. He did not offer gold or false promises. He simply sat with the mother, his hand resting on her shoulder in a gesture of shared humanity. He asked the entire caravan, in their evening prayers, to pray for the child. He sent his own cook to prepare a special, nourishing broth. He sat there for hours, a silent, comforting presence, until the fever finally broke in the cool hours before dawn. The boy would live. The Mansa's quiet act of compassion did more to secure the love and loyalty of his people than any grand display of wealth ever could. Weeks turned into months. The ocean of sand seemed endless, but the Tuareg guides were true to their word. One afternoon, Tariq pointed to the horizon. "Look," he said, "the air changes. Life is returning." At first, there was nothing to see. But as they traveled on, they began to notice subtle signs. A hardy desert shrub, a flock of birds flying purposefully in one direction, and then a faint, dark line on the horizon. As they drew closer over the next day, the line resolved itself into a smudge of green. It was the valley of the Nile, the great river of Egypt. The transition was breathtaking. They crested a final, massive dune, and there below them, stretching out like a green ribbon of life, was the legendary river. After months of seeing only the muted tones of the desert, the vibrant, impossible green of the fertile valley was a shock to the senses. It was a vision of paradise. A great, collective sigh of relief and wonder went through the caravan. They had done it. They had crossed the great Sahara. They had walked through the sea of sand and arrived at the shores of a new world, their spirits tested, their community forged in the crucible of the desert, and their hearts filled with a quiet, unshakable faith. The arrival in Egypt was like emerging from a long, silent dream into a world of vibrant, clamorous life. The caravan, which had been a self-contained universe moving through the emptiness of the Sahara, now encountered a civilization of dazzling complexity and ancient grandeur. The first city they reached was Alexandria, a port bustling with ships from every corner of the known world. But their ultimate destination was Cairo, the magnificent heart of the Mamluk Sultanate. As the vast procession of the Malians approached the outskirts of Cairo, news of their coming spread like wildfire. Rumors had preceded them, tales of a king from the south, a king of legendary wealth, leading a caravan of unimaginable size on a holy pilgrimage. The people of Cairo, accustomed to the sight of wealth and power, were nonetheless unprepared for the reality of Mansa Musa's arrival. The caravan did not enter the city like a conquering army. It moved with the same deliberate, peaceful grace that had carried it across the desert. But its scale was simply overwhelming. The endless line of people in their brightly colored robes, the thousands of camels adorned with fine leather and tassels, and the sheer, disciplined order of the procession left the onlookers speechless. Mansa Musa, guided by protocol, made camp outside the city walls, in the plains beneath the shadow of the great pyramids of Giza. It was a gesture of respect for the reigning Mamluk Sultan, Al-Nasir Muhammad. He sent emissaries ahead with gifts, not just gold, but rare ivories, fine leatherwork, and exotic spices, and a message of peace and brotherhood. The Sultan, a powerful and shrewd ruler, was intrigued. He sent a delegation to welcome the Mansa and invite him to the city. The meeting between the two rulers was a study in contrasts. Al-Nasir Muhammad, surrounded by the stony splendor of his Cairo citadel, was a man accustomed to the intricate and often dangerous politics of a major world power. Mansa Musa, serene and dignified, carried with him the quiet authority of a king, whose power was rooted in the deep, foundational wealth of his land and the devotion of his people. There was a moment of diplomatic tension. The Sultan's protocol demanded that all visitors, even fellow kings, should bow and kiss the ground before him. Mansa Musa's advisors were aghast. Their Mansa bowed to no man, only to God, but Musa, with his characteristic wisdom, found a peaceful solution. "I am a pilgrim in this land," he declared, his voice calm and clear. "My only desire is to bow to God, who has brought me safely out of the desert." And so, upon entering the Sultan's audience hall, he turned, knelt, and prayed, his forehead touching the ground, in a gesture of piety that fulfilled his own spiritual need, while simultaneously satisfying the Sultan's requirement for a bow. This act of profound grace and clever diplomacy immediately earned him the respect of the entire Cairene court. The Sultan, impressed, treated Mansa Musa not as a vassal but as an equal. They spent many hours in conversation, speaking through translators. They discussed matters of faith, of law, of governance, and of trade. The Sultan was fascinated by the tales of the Mali Empire, a kingdom whose existence he had only been dimly aware of. Mansa Musa, in turn, was eager to learn about the wider Islamic world, its scholarship, its architecture, and its complex web of alliances. While the diplomats talked, the true impact of the Malian presence was felt on the streets of Cairo. This was where Mansa Musa's legendary generosity was unleashed in a torrent of gold. He had come not to trade or to barter, but to give. Every Friday, the holy day, he would distribute vast quantities of gold dust. His almoners set up stations in the markets and outside the great mosques. They gave to the poor, to the widows, to the orphans, to the struggling students of the great Al-Azhar University. The effect was staggering. The people of Cairo had never seen such wealth given away so freely. Gold, which had been a precious and carefully managed commodity, suddenly became abundant. The value of the local currency, the dinar, began to fall as the markets were flooded with Malian gold. The price of goods, from bread to silk, began to inflate. For years afterward, economists and historians would speak of how a single man, through an act of pure, unadulterated charity, had unintentionally disrupted the economy of the entire Mediterranean region. But for the common people of Cairo, it was a time of miracles. A baker who could barely feed his family was suddenly able to buy a new oven. A scholar who had to copy books by hand because he could not afford to buy them was now able to purchase his own library. The generosity was not just a spectacle. It was a life-altering event for thousands of individuals. Mansa Musa also became a great patron of the city's wonders. He visited the mosques, the libraries, and the bustling Khan el-Khalili Bazaar. He did not haggle. He would ask the price of an item: a finely illuminated Quran, a bolt of Egyptian cotton, a beautifully crafted astrolabe, and he would pay double, leaving the merchants breathless with shock and gratitude. He commissioned local artisans to create works of art to take back with him, and he hired guides to show his people the sights of the ancient city. His scholars, meanwhile, found their own paradise in Cairo's centers of learning. They spent their days in the libraries, poring over texts that were rare or unknown in West Africa. They engaged in spirited debates with the Cairene Ulema, the Council of Islamic Scholars, discussing fine points of theology, philosophy, and science. The exchange was a two-way street. The Egyptians were astounded by the depth of learning the Malians possessed, their unique perspectives on Islamic law, and their rich oral traditions. The pilgrimage was becoming a bridge of knowledge, connecting the intellectual worlds of North and West Africa. Kale, the young astronomer, was in a state of constant wonder. He met with Egyptian astronomers who had inherited the knowledge of the ancient Greeks and Persians. They showed him advanced astronomical charts, more complex astrolabes, and texts that described celestial mechanics in ways he had only dreamed of. He spent his nights on the flat rooftops of Cairo, sharing his knowledge of the southern stars, which were invisible in the northern sky, and eagerly absorbing their understanding of the northern constellations. After several weeks in Cairo, the time came to continue the journey. The caravan, now even larger with the addition of new guides, merchants, and scholars who wished to travel with the famously generous king, set out once more. They followed the ancient route to the east, towards the Sinai Peninsula and the Holy Land of Arabia. Their time in Egypt had been transformative. They had arrived as strangers from a distant, almost mythical land. They left as respected brothers in faith, their king's name a legend on the lips of everyone from the Sultan in his palace to the beggars in the streets. Mansa Musa had not just passed through Cairo. He had left an indelible mark upon it, a shimmering golden memory of a king whose wealth was surpassed only by his piety and the boundless generosity of his heart. The bridge between Mali and the wider world had been built, and its foundations were made of pure gold. The final leg of the journey to Mecca was imbued with a palpable sense of spiritual anticipation. The caravan moved out of the lush Nile Delta, crossing the harsh, stony landscape of the Sinai. They passed by Mount Sinai, the holy peak where God was said to have given the 10 Commandments to Moses, and the pilgrims paused for a day of prayer and reflection, feeling the immense weight of the history held within those rugged, sun-baked mountains. Finally, they crossed the Red Sea and set foot in Arabia, the birthplace of their faith. The landscape was stark and beautiful, a world of rocky hills and sandy plains, under a vast open sky. As they drew closer to the holy cities, their numbers swelled. Pilgrims from Persia, from the Levant, from Anatolia, and from the distant lands of the Silk Road joined the great river of humanity flowing towards Mecca. All distinctions of rank and race began to dissolve, replaced by a shared identity. They were all simply pilgrims, guests of God. The arrival in Mecca was the culmination of a year of travel and a lifetime of yearning. As they crested the final hill and saw the city nestled in the valley below, a sound of pure, unadulterated emotion rose from the caravan. It was a cry of joy, of relief, of overwhelming gratitude. At the heart of the city, they could see the Grand Mosque, and within it, the simple, profound shape of the Kaaba, the black draped cube that is the focal point of prayer for Muslims across the globe. Here, in the holiest of cities, Mansa Musa ceased to be the emperor of Mali. He removed his fine robes and, like every other male pilgrim, donned the ihram, two simple, seamless sheets of white cloth. This act of humility stripped away all worldly status. The richest king on earth now looked no different from the poorest farmer from Yemen. His vast honor guard, his advisors, his very identity as a monarch were all set aside. He was simply Musa, a servant of God. He performed the rituals of the Hajj with profound devotion. He circumambulated the Kaaba 7 times, part of a massive, swirling ocean of humanity, their voices joined in a single chanted prayer, the Talbiyah, "Here I am, O God, here I am." The sound was immense, the collective voice of a global faith, and it resonated deep in his soul. He walked between the hills of Safa and Marwa, reenacting the desperate search for water by Hagar, the wife of Abraham. He traveled to the plain of Arafat, standing from noon until sunset, in prayer and contemplation, seeking forgiveness and mercy. It was an experience of profound spiritual renewal. The gold he had brought with him continued to flow, but here it was not about displaying wealth. It was about fulfilling the sacred duty of zakat, of charity. He funded the construction of shelters for poor pilgrims, paid for the digging of new wells along the pilgrimage routes, and distributed alms to the residents of the holy city. His name became synonymous with piety and generosity. After completing the Hajj in Mecca, he traveled to the city of Medina, the city of the Prophet Muhammad. He prayed in the Prophet's mosque and visited his tomb, offering prayers and respects. Medina was a quieter, more contemplative city than Mecca, and he spent several weeks there, meeting with scholars and deepening his understanding of the origins of his faith. The journey back was different. The great spiritual goal had been achieved. The mood was one of peaceful accomplishment and thoughtful reflection. Mansa Musa was a changed man. He had left Mali as a great king. He was returning as a Haji, a title of immense respect, but also as a man whose perspective had been fundamentally altered. He had seen the vastness of the world, the diversity of its people, and the unifying power of a shared faith. He had seen great cities, ancient wonders, and centers of learning that rivaled his own, and he was inspired. His mission was no longer just to return home. It was to bring the best of what he had seen back to his own people. On his journey, he had been actively recruiting. He offered handsome rewards and positions of honor to the brightest minds he encountered. He persuaded architects, doctors, poets, and, most importantly, scholars of Islamic law and theology to return with him to Mali. His most significant recruit was a poet and architect from Andalusia named Abu Ishaq al-Sahili. Al-Sahili was a man of immense talent, renowned for his innovative building techniques and his sophisticated aesthetic sense. Mansa Musa had been captivated by the grand mosques and palaces of Cairo and Mecca, with their soaring minarets, elegant arches, and intricate tile work. He saw in al-Sahili the man who could bring this architectural beauty to the heart of the Mali Empire. The return journey through Cairo was a mirror image of their arrival. Mansa Musa was now a celebrated figure. The Sultan welcomed him back with even greater honors. But the Mansa's generosity had had its consequences. The value of gold was so depressed that he found himself in the unexpected position of needing to borrow money to finance the final leg of his journey home. In a final remarkable act, he borrowed vast sums from the merchants of Cairo at high interest. This action single-handedly stabilized the Cairene economy. He took so much gold out of circulation that its value soared once more, restoring the fortunes of the very merchants from whom he borrowed. It was an act of economic finesse that became as legendary as his initial generosity. The crossing of the Sahara on the return journey was no less arduous, but the caravan faced it with the quiet confidence of seasoned travelers. They knew the rhythms of the desert now. They were guided by the familiar stars in the night sky. Kale, the astronomer, now possessed new charts and instruments, and his nightly lectures were filled with new knowledge gleaned from his time in Egypt. As they finally left the sands behind and saw the familiar green of the savanna of their homeland, a different kind of joy spread through the caravan. It was the joy of homecoming. They had been gone for nearly 2 years. They had crossed the world, and now they were returning, their minds filled with new ideas, their bags filled with new books, and their numbers increased by the foreign scholars and artisans who had chosen to cast their lot with this remarkable king. When Mansa Musa finally rode back into his capital city of Niani, the celebration was immense. But it was a celebration of thanksgiving, not of conquest. His people welcomed him back not just as their king, but as their spiritual guide, a man who had completed the sacred journey on their behalf. The pilgrimage was over, but its true legacy was just beginning. The gold that Mansa Musa had spent was a fleeting thing, a temporary disruption in the world's economy. But the knowledge, the ideas, and the people he brought back with him would be the seeds of a golden age. He had traveled to the edge of his world and returned, not with conquered lands, but with a renewed vision for his own empire, a vision of a Mali that would become a beacon of learning, faith, and peace for all of Africa. The journey had ended, but the transformation of his kingdom was about to begin. The Mali that Mansa Musa returned to was prosperous and peaceful, having been managed ably by his son and his council in his absence. But the Mansa himself was not the same. The world he had seen had expanded his vision for his own empire. He had seen the magnificent centers of learning in Cairo and the profound spirituality of Mecca. He no longer wanted Mali to be known merely for its gold. He wanted it to be known for its wisdom, its faith, and its culture. He set about transforming his kingdom with the same meticulous, peaceful determination that had carried him across the Sahara. His first and most ambitious project was the transformation of Timbuktu. For centuries, Timbuktu had been a prosperous trading post on the edge of the desert, a place where salt from the north was exchanged for gold from the south. But Mansa Musa envisioned it as something more. He wanted it to be a great city of scholarship, a West African Cairo, a beacon of knowledge that would shine for generations. He gave the architect he had brought from Andalusia, Al-Sahili, a grand commission. "I want you to build me a mosque," the Mansa said, as they stood on a dusty plain on the outskirts of the city. "A mosque so grand and beautiful that it will call the faithful from 100 miles away. And next to it, I want you to build a university, a place where any mind thirsty for knowledge can come to drink." Al-Sahili, a man of great imagination, set to work. He was a master of building with the materials of the land. He taught the Malian builders new techniques for working with fired brick and for reinforcing the traditional beaten earth with wooden supports, allowing them to build higher and more elegantly than ever before. The result was the Jingarober Mosque. It was a structure of breathtaking scale and unique beauty. Its great pyramidal minaret rose against the blue desert sky. Its walls were studded with protruding wooden beams, giving it a distinctive, almost hedgehog-like appearance that was both functional, providing scaffolding for replastering, and aesthetically striking. It was a perfect fusion of Andalusian design and West African materials and style. Adjacent to the mosque, the Sankore Madrasa, or university, began to take shape. It was not a single building, but a sprawling complex of schools and libraries. Mansa Musa poured his wealth into its foundation. He sent emissaries to all corners of the Islamic world, to Fez, to Cairo, to Baghdad, with instructions to buy books. Not just any books, but every book of value they could find on every subject imaginable: theology, law, mathematics, medicine, geography, and, of course, astronomy for his protege, Kale. The books arrived by the camel load. Soon, the libraries of Timbuktu held one of the greatest collections of manuscripts in the world, estimated by some to be larger than any single library in Europe at the time. The scholars that Mansa Musa had brought with him formed the core of the university's faculty, and their presence attracted other great minds from across Africa and the Middle East. Timbuktu blossomed. The quiet trading town became a bustling, cosmopolitan city. Its narrow streets were filled with students from all over the empire, their voices animatedly debating points of philosophy as they walked to their classes. The sound of children reciting the Quran echoed from the courtyards. In the markets, alongside the blocks of salt and bags of gold dust, one could now find merchants selling rare manuscripts, fine paper, and ink. The city became a place where the wealth of the mind was valued as highly as the wealth of the earth. Mansa Musa's influence extended far beyond Timbuktu. In his capital of Niani and in other major cities like Gao, he commissioned more mosques, more schools, more public buildings. He reformed the administration of his empire, applying principles of law and governance he had learned about on his journey. His court became a center for the arts. The griots, like Jolifode, now had a new and epic tale to add to their repertoire, the Great Hajj of Mansa Musa. Their songs, accompanied by the gentle, rippling notes of the kora, told the story to a new generation, embedding the journey into the cultural memory of the nation. The story was not one of war and conquest, but of peace, piety, and the pursuit of knowledge. The empire settled into a long and peaceful autumn under his rule. The trade routes were secure, the harvests were plentiful, and the people were content. The Mansa himself, now with streaks of silver in his beard, spent less time in the audience hall and more time in his personal library, which was now vast and filled with precious texts. He would sit for hours with scholars like Kale, discussing the movements of the planets or the subtleties of a philosophical argument. He had become more than just a king. He was a patron, a philosopher, a man of profound faith. He had seen the wider world, and instead of being intimidated by it, he had peacefully and confidently connected his own empire to it. He had shown the world the sophistication and wealth of Mali, not through aggression, but through an act of supreme grace and generosity. And he had brought the world back with him, enriching his own culture with new ideas, new art, and new knowledge. In the evenings, he would often walk in his gardens, just as he had done all those years ago when he was first contemplating his great journey. The air was still filled with the same sweet scents and the gentle sounds of the river. But now, when he looked up at the stars, he saw them with new eyes. He saw them through the lens of Kale's teachings, through the knowledge contained in the books in his library. He saw the celestial map that had guided him across the desert and safely home again. He had set out on his pilgrimage to fulfill a personal religious duty, to answer a quiet call in his own heart. He had returned having laid the foundations for a golden age. His legacy would not be measured in the gold he had spent, which was soon absorbed into the treasuries of the world, but in the mosques that pointed to the heavens, in the universities that illuminated the minds of his people, and in the books that preserved wisdom for centuries to come. As the sun would set over the great Niger River, casting a final warm glow over the peaceful city of Niani, the sounds of life would soften. From the distant city of Timbuktu, one could almost imagine hearing the faint murmur of students and teachers discussing the stars, the law, and the nature of God. The story of Mansa Musa, the Lion of Mali, the Lord of the Mines of Wangara, became a bedtime story in itself, whispered by mothers to their children across the empire. It was a story of a great king who embarked on a journey of peace and returned to build a kingdom of knowledge. A story of a golden caravan that traveled across the sand and a golden age that dawned in its wake. And as the last light faded from the sky and the first stars began their silent, watchful journey across the night, the great peaceful empire of Mali would settle into a deep and well-earned sleep, dreaming under the vast, benevolent African sky.